I've sat in that conference room maybe 200 times over the years. Same beige walls, same crooked whiteboard nobody ever bothered to wipe clean, same faint smell of burnt coffee and printer toner drifting in from the hallway. But this time felt different. This time the air had teeth. You know, that quiet that isn't really quiet. The kind that hums under fluorescent lights and makes your ears ring. That's the sound of somebody rehearsing bad news in their head before they say it out loud. Across the table sat Bradley Coleman, our brand new VP of Finance, 34 years old, MBA from somewhere with ivy on the walls, a haircut that probably cost more than my first car. Next to him, Cheryl from HR, tapping her manicured nail on a folder like she was keeping time with a song only she could hear. And me, Anil Menon, 61 years old, Senior Controller for Halbrook Industrial. 42 years in accounting, 27 of them at this exact company. I already knew what was coming. You don't survive 4 decades in this business without learning how to read a room the second you walk into it. Bradley finally cleared his throat. "Anil," he said, in that slow, careful voice people use when they think you don't quite understand English. Which is a special kind of insult when English happens to be one of 4 languages you speak fluently. We've been reviewing the department's roadmap, and as you know, we're modernizing our systems, moving fully to the new cloud ERP by Q3. I nodded. I knew. I was the one who'd flagged half the migration risks in a memo he never read. He kept going. "Given the shift, we're going to need everyone on the team fully certified in the new platform. That means completing the retraining program, 90 days, evenings and weekends included." Then he paused, adjusted his cuffs. "Otherwise, we'll have to explore other arrangements." Other arrangements. That's corporate for get out. That's a 34-year-old telling a 61-year-old to jump through hoops he knows I won't jump through so he can push me out clean and call it my choice. 90 days of night classes for a system I already understood better than the consultants teaching it. Faking a smile while some 26-year-old contractor explained debits and credits to a man who'd been closing books since before her parents met. Quick note before I go further, drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I'm curious how far this story travels tonight. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. My father used to say the loudest man in the room is usually the one who's already lost. So I just folded my hands, looked Bradley dead in the eye and said, "I understand. May I have a few days to consider?" Cheryl gave me that tight HR smile. Bradley nodded like a king granting favors. "Of course, take the week." I stood up. My knees cracked, because they always crack now, and I walked out of that conference room with my back straight and my chest calm, even though something deep inside me had already caught fire. I passed the cubicles I'd personally helped lay out when we moved into this building in 1999. I passed the framed photo of the founding team in the lobby. My face right there in the second row. 28 years younger, hair still black, standing next to old Mr. Halbrook himself, the man who used to call me his walking calculator in front of the whole board. I made it to my office, closed the door quietly because I do everything quietly, and sat down at my desk. My hands were shaking, not from fear, from something older, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I looked at the ledger open on my screen and I actually smiled. Because Bradley Coleman had just made the biggest mistake of his short little career, and he didn't have the first clue. Let me tell you something about Halbrook Industrial that Bradley Coleman didn't know, because Bradley Coleman had never bothered to ask. When I joined this company in 1998, we were a mid-sized manufacturing outfit with 3 plants, 92 employees, and a book situation that could charitably be described as a disaster. Old Mr. Halbrook, the founder, was a brilliant engineer and a terrible bookkeeper. He kept receipts in cigar boxes. He tracked inventory on yellow legal pads. He once handed me a shoebox full of vendor invoices and said, "Anil, figure it out." And I did. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 straight weekends, my wife bringing me chai every few hours, and I built that company its first real chart of accounts from scratch. By 2003, I'd rebuilt the entire general ledger structure. By 2007, I designed the cost accounting system we still used, or a version of it, all the way up until this ridiculous migration Bradley was so proud of. Every intercompany transfer pricing model, every inventory valuation method, every tax provision workflow, every audit trail that had kept us clean through 6 external audits and 2 IRS inquiries. That was me, not a team, not a consultant, me. Sitting at my desk at 11 at night while my kids grew up in photographs. I missed my daughter Priya's high school graduation because we were closing the year-end books during the acquisition of Weatherman components. I missed my son Rohan's first college move-in because a vendor had double-billed us $600,000, and I was the only one who could untangle it. My wife, Mina, she never complained. Not once. She just kept the house running and told the kids their father was building something that would take care of them one day. That was our deal. That was our whole life. And now here comes Bradley Coleman, hired 6 months ago after the private equity firm bought a controlling stake and started what they called Operational Excellence Transformation, which is corporate for firing everyone over 50 and replacing them with cheaper models. He walked into my department like he was on some kind of safari, poking at spreadsheets, asking why we did things a certain way. Getting the answer, not understanding the answer, and then declaring the answer outdated. That was his whole method. If Bradley didn't understand it, it was old. If it was old, it was wrong. If it was wrong, it had to be replaced, preferably by something a consultant could sell him at a markup. The first time we butted heads was over the manufacturing overhead allocation. He wanted to switch to a simplified activity-based costing model that some vendor had pitched him. I explained patiently in writing in a meeting, and again in a follow-up email, why our current model was actually more accurate for our specific product mix. He nodded, thanked me, and did it anyway. 6 weeks later, our margins on the industrial fastener line looked artificially inflated by 19%, and we almost misquoted a major bid because of it. I caught it. I fixed it. Bradley took credit for identifying the anomaly in his quarterly report. That was the moment I understood who I was dealing with. Not a bad man exactly, just a hollow one. The kind of executive who mistakes confidence for competence and volume for value. He'd been given a job he wasn't ready for, and instead of learning, he decided to remove anyone who might expose that fact. Starting with me. So when he sat there in that conference room and told me to retrain or leave, he thought he was cornering an old man. What he didn't know was that our ledgers, the real ones, the ones with 27 years of institutional memory baked into them, only truly made sense to one person in that entire building. And that person had just been told to prove his worth to a boy who couldn't read them. I drove home that evening the long way. Took the back roads through the industrial park, past the old Halbrook plant where I used to walk the floor with Mr. Halbrook himself back when he was still alive, back when he'd point at a machine and ask me what it cost to run per hour, and I could tell him down to the penny without opening a file. The sun was setting behind the water tower, that orange kind of light that makes everything look older than it really is. I gripped the steering wheel and tried to keep my breathing even. Mina was going to see it on my face the second I walked through the door. 41 years of marriage and that woman could read me like a balance sheet. Sure enough, I opened the door and she was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove, and she didn't even turn around. Just said, "What happened, Anno?" I laughed. I actually laughed because what else can you do when someone knows you that well? I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd rebuilt Halbrook's chart of accounts 26 years earlier, and I told her everything. Bradley, Cheryl, the 90 days, the other arrangements, the whole rotten performance. She listened without interrupting, poured me a cup of chai, sat down across from me, and when I was done she just looked at me for a long moment and said, "Anil, we don't need the job, we have never needed the job. You need to decide what you want to do next, not what they want you to do." That's my wife. 20 words when a lesser person would have used 200. She was right, of course. The mortgage was paid off in 2018. The kids were grown, both doing well, Priya an emergency medicine physician in Boston, Rohan a mechanical engineer at a wind energy firm in Denver. We had savings. We had my pension vesting. We had options. What I didn't have, what I hadn't allowed myself to have in a very long time, was the freedom to actually consider those options without guilt. But something else was chewing at me, something I hadn't told Mina yet, because I wanted to be sure before I said it out loud. See, over the last 4 months, I'd been noticing things, small things, the kind of things only a man who'd built the ledger himself could notice. A vendor payment routed through a new bank account. A capitalized expense that didn't quite match the project code. An intercompany transfer between our Ohio subsidiary and a shell entity in Delaware that had been dormant since 2011 and had suddenly, quietly, been reactivated 3 months ago. None of it was screaming fraud. Not exactly. It was more like watching a magic trick where you can't quite see the sleight of hand but you know something's off. And every single one of those transactions traced back, in one way or another, to a workflow Bradley Coleman had personally approved or pushed through the new ERP migration. The migration he was so eager to complete. The migration that would flush out all the legacy audit trails and replace them with a clean, consultant-designed system that only reported what the new administrators wanted it to report. I hadn't told anyone, not because I was scared, because I wasn't sure yet. And a man who spends his life in debentry accounting learns very early that suspicion without evidence is just noise. But sitting there at that kitchen table, holding my wife's hand, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit through 90 days of retraining. I wasn't going to give Bradley Coleman the satisfaction of watching me shuffle off quietly with a plaque and a sheet cake in the break room. I was going to leave. On my terms. But not before I finished pulling on the loose thread I'd found. Because if I was right about what was happening in those ledgers, Bradley wasn't just pushing me out. He was cleaning up. The next morning I got to the office at 6, 2 hours before anyone else. The building was quiet the way old buildings get in the early hours, that low hum of the HVAC and the buzz of the parking lot lights just starting to switch off. I made myself a cup of instant coffee from the break room, the terrible kind that tastes like burnt cardboard, and I sat down at my desk and opened the ledger. Not the pretty dashboard view Bradley liked to show off in his slide decks. The real ledger, the one underneath, the transactional layer where the actual money lived. I want to be careful how I explain this next part, because I know most people watching this aren't accountants. But here's the thing about a well-designed general ledger. It doesn't lie. People lie. Systems get manipulated. But the underlying debentry math, debit equals credit, every single time, always, forever, that math cannot lie. If money moves, it leaves a footprint. Even when someone tries very hard to erase it, they leave a footprint of the erasure. And I had spent 27 years learning where every single footprint in this company got left. I started with the Delaware shell entity, Halbrook Capital Reserve LLC, set up in 2009, for a legitimate tax deferral vehicle related to an equipment financing arrangement. Wound down operationally in 2011, kept on the books as a dormant subsidiary because dissolving it would have triggered some minor reporting complications, and nobody had ever bothered to circle back and clean it up. Classic institutional inertia. I knew about it because I was the one who set it up. Except now, in the last 90 days, Halbrook Capital Reserve LLC had processed 11 intercompany transactions totaling just over $4.2 million. Every single one of them coded as consulting fees. Every single one of them approved through the new ERP workflow. Every single one of them routed to a bank account I did not recognize, at a bank in Wilmington that we had never done business with in the entire history of the company. And every single one of them, and this was the part that made my hands go cold, had a secondary journal entry that reclassified the outflow as a capitalized software development cost against the ERP migration project, which meant on the surface, on the reports that went to the board and the auditors, that money looked like it had been spent on our own IT modernization, when in reality it had been wired to a shell company and vanished. $4.2 million in 90 days. And the migration wasn't even done yet. I sat back in my chair. My heart was pounding, but my head was very, very calm, because now I understood what the retraining ultimatum actually was. It wasn't ageism. It wasn't even cost-cutting. It was containment. Bradley needed me out of that ledger before Q3 close. He needed the migration to complete so the legacy audit trails would be archived to cold storage where nobody would ever bother to look. And he needed me either signing an NDA on my way out with a severance package, or discredited enough as a stubborn old man refusing to modernize that anything I said afterward would sound like sour grapes. I pulled up the vendor master file, cross-referenced the bank account, ran a query against the wire transfer log. Then I did something I had not done in 15 years. I opened the paper archive room, the one nobody ever went into anymore that Bradley had actually proposed converting into a wellness lounge last quarter, and I pulled the original 2009 incorporation binder for Halbrook Capital Reserve LLC, the one with the signature card, the one that listed the authorized signatories. There were two names on that card: Mr. Halbrook, deceased since 2016, and Anil Menon, me. Nobody else had ever been added. Legally, on paper, that shell company still answered to exactly one living human being, and it wasn't Bradley Coleman. I closed that binder very slowly, the way you close a door on a sleeping child. Then I put it back exactly where I found it, because I wasn't ready for anyone to know I'd been looking. I walked back to my office, sat down, and stared at the wall for a long time, because what I was looking at wasn't just an accounting irregularity. It was a genuine, textbook, federal crime-level embezzlement scheme, and the person running it had, whether he knew it or not, been signing wire authorizations against a legal entity that he had no authority over, which meant every single one of those 11 transactions was, technically, unauthorized use of a corporate instrument by someone who was not a signatory, which was a whole other layer of exposure sitting on top of the fraud itself. Now I want to pause here and say something important, because I know how this sounds. It sounds like the moment in the story where the wronged old man discovers the smoking gun and rides in on a white horse to save the day. Real life doesn't work like that. Real life is messier. I had a lot of questions I couldn't answer yet. Was Bradley acting alone? Was the CFO involved? Was the private equity firm behind it, using Bradley as a disposable middleman who would take the fall if anything unraveled? Was the money actually being stolen, or was it being parked somewhere for a legitimate but poorly documented reason I hadn't figured out yet? An accountant who jumps to conclusions is an accountant who ends up in a defamation suit. I needed more, so I did what I've always done. I worked the problem, quietly, methodically. Over the next 3 days, I came in at 6 every morning, and I traced every single transaction back to its origin. I pulled the approval chains. I pulled the workflow logs. I matched invoice dates against email metadata using the archive search tool that Bradley had never bothered to learn existed. I found that the invoices from the shell entity were being generated by a template stored on a shared drive that had been created by an outside contractor Bradley had personally onboarded. The same contractor who had been running the ERP migration steering committee. The same contractor whose firm had, according to a quick search on the state business registry, been incorporated just 14 months ago, with a registered agent address that matched a UPS store in Wilmington, Delaware, the same city where the shell entity's bank account was. At that point, I stopped digging on the company network. Because a man who has spent 42 years in accounting has also spent 42 years watching people get caught by their own digital footprints. Every query I ran was logged. Every file I opened was tracked. If Bradley or his contractor had even a moderately competent IT person watching the audit logs, my curiosity was going to show up on someone's dashboard. And I was not yet ready to be the man asking the questions. I was still the man being asked to leave. So I went old school. I printed nothing. I photographed nothing on company equipment. Instead, at the end of each day, I sat at my desk with a legal pad and I wrote down from memory what I had found, just for me, just to keep the picture straight. Then I took that legal pad home and locked it in the safe in my basement, the one Mina and I had installed after Priya's medical school documents went missing during a move. On Thursday evening, I called my brother-in-law. His name is Vikram. He's a retired federal prosecutor. Spent 22 years at the Department of Justice, mostly working white-collar cases. He picked up on the second ring. I said, Vic, hypothetically speaking, if a man discovered something at his job and that man was about to be pushed out of that job, what should that man do first? There was a long pause. Then Vikram said, Anil, come over tonight. Vikram lives about 40 minutes outside the city in a quiet neighborhood where the houses all have too much lawn and not enough sidewalk. I drove over that same evening. Mina came with me. She didn't ask why. She just picked up her purse when I picked up my keys and we went. That's the kind of partner she is. When something serious is happening, she doesn't need briefings. She just shows up. Vikram met us at the door in a cardigan and reading glasses, holding a glass of red wine like he'd been expecting us all day. His wife Anjali, Mina's older sister, hugged us both and then said, I'm going to take Mina into the kitchen. You two go talk. That's how it works in our family. Everyone knows their role without anyone having to say it. Vikram led me to his study. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, mostly legal texts, a few history books, one shelf of mystery novels his wife bought him that he'd never opened. He closed the door, sat down behind his desk, gestured at the chair across from him. And then he said, All right, Anil, tell me everything. And don't leave anything out because you think it's small. Small things are how these cases get made. I talked for almost 2 hours. I laid it out exactly the way I would have laid out a reconciliation to an auditor. The shell entity, the signature card, the 11 transactions, the reclassifications, the contractor, the Wilmington UPS store, the retraining ultimatum, Bradley, the private equity firm. I told him about the ERP migration timeline and why it mattered. I told him about the paper archive room. I told him about the legal pad in my safe. I did not embellish. I did not speculate. I gave him facts and timestamps and dollar amounts. Vikram didn't interrupt once. He just sat there with his fingers steepled under his chin, looking at me over the top of his reading glasses, occasionally jotting a note on a yellow legal pad of his own. When I finally finished, he set his pen down, took a long sip of his wine and said, Anil, you need to listen to me very carefully now, because what I'm about to tell you is going to shape the next 6 months of your life. He said the first thing was that I could not, under any circumstances, confront Bradley. Not directly, not sideways, not through a resignation letter that hinted at anything, not through a lawyer, not through a whistleblower memo, not through a passive-aggressive email. Anything that put Bradley on notice would give him the runway to destroy evidence, coach the contractor, or, more likely, restructure the transactions retroactively so they looked like an honest mistake. And once the ERP migration completed, the archived legacy data would be functionally inaccessible without a court order, which is the exact reason the timing was what it was. The second thing was that I could not, under any circumstances, remove documents from company property. Not photographs, not printouts, not even my legal pad if it contained transaction numbers or vendor names. Because the moment I walked out of that building with proprietary financial data in my hand, I stopped being a witness and started being a defendant. Bradley's lawyers would spend the entire case arguing I was a disgruntled ex-employee who fabricated a scheme to cover my own theft. He'd seen it happen a dozen times. The third thing was that I needed to leave, immediately, on my own terms, cleanly, with no accusations, no drama, and no hint of what I knew. I needed to walk out of Halbrook Industrial as an ordinary retiree, wave goodbye, take the sheet cake, and disappear into the sunset of my career. And then from the outside, from a position where I was no longer an employee subject to their control, I needed to make one very specific phone call. He wrote down a name, slid the paper across the desk. I looked down at the paper. The name written on it was Rebecca Ostrowski. Underneath it, a phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. Vikram tapped the paper once with his index finger and said, She's a special agent with the FBI, White Collar Crime Division. She and I worked 6 cases together before I retired. She is very good at her job and more importantly, she is patient. She will not blow this open in a week. She will build it the right way. He paused. If what you're describing is real, and I believe you that it is, She will want to talk to you the same day you call. But she will not want you to call until you are no longer inside that building. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my wallet behind my driver's license, where I would remember exactly where it was but where nobody looking through my wallet would notice it. Then I asked Vikram the question I'd been carrying with me for 3 days. Vic, am I obligated to do this? Legally, I mean. If I just retire and walk away and never make the call, am I on the hook for anything? He thought about it for a long moment. Then he said, legally, probably not. You're not a corporate officer. You didn't sign the fraudulent transactions. You have no fiduciary duty to shareholders that would require you to blow the whistle. You could walk away, cash your pension, spend your Sundays gardening, and no one would ever come after you. He took another sip of wine. But Anil, you've known me for 38 years. You know what I'm going to say next. I did. Because Vikram and I are cut from the same cloth in this one particular way. We both grew up in households where our fathers taught us that a man's name is the only thing he really owns, and the moment he trades it for peace and quiet, he has nothing left worth protecting. I'd built those ledgers. I'd built that company. Old Mr. Halbrook had trusted me with the keys to a kingdom that his grandchildren still owned shares in. 92 people worked at that plant in Ohio, and I knew a lot of them by name, and none of them had any idea that $4.2 million of the company's cash had already walked out the back door dressed as consulting fees. If I said nothing, and it kept going, and the whole thing collapsed in 18 months when the private equity firm dumped their stake and vanished, those 92 people were the ones who'd lose their jobs. Not Bradley, not the contractor, not the PE partners in their Manhattan offices. I nodded. Vikram nodded back. And that was the whole conversation. Nothing more needed saying. We drove home in silence, Meena and I. She didn't ask what we discussed and I didn't offer. When we got home, she made me a fresh cup of chai, put a small plate of biscuits next to it and said, "Whatever you decided in there, Anil, I'm with you." Then she went upstairs to bed. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night. Long enough that the chai went cold. I thought about my father, who came to this country in 1971 with $200 in his pocket and worked as a night auditor at a hotel for 11 years before he saved enough to open his own small accounting practice. I thought about the first ledger he ever showed me, when I was 9 years old, sitting on a stool next to his desk in that tiny office above the dry cleaners. He'd pointed at a column of numbers and said, "Anil, this is a language. When you learn it, you learn how to see what people are really doing." I'd been seeing for 42 years. I wasn't going to stop now. Monday morning, I walked into Bradley Coleman's office at exactly 9 o'clock. I'd asked Cheryl to schedule the meeting on Friday afternoon, framed as a follow-up to our earlier conversation. Bradley was already at his standing desk, tapping away at his laptop, wearing one of those quarter-zip pullovers that finance guys wear when they want you to know they went to business school. He looked up, gave me that condescending half-smile and said, "Anil, come in. Have you thought about the retraining program?" I sat down across from him, folded my hands in my lap, and I said, "Bradley, thank you for the opportunity. After careful reflection, I've decided that this is the right moment for me to retire. I'll be submitting my formal notice today, effective in 2 weeks. I want to make sure the transition is smooth for the team, and I'm happy to document anything that would be useful for whoever takes over my responsibilities." I watched his face very carefully as I said it, because a man in Bradley's position, if he'd been up to what I thought he'd been up to, would have exactly one reaction: relief. Not surprise, not disappointment, not concern about losing institutional knowledge, just relief. And there it was. It flashed across his face for maybe half a second before he caught it and reassembled his features into something resembling professional regret. He said, "Anil, wow, that's a big decision. Are you sure? We really value your contributions." Every word rehearsed, every syllable hollow. I said, "I'm sure. 42 years is enough. It's time." He nodded solemnly. Told me the company would want to recognize my service properly. Something with the leadership team. Maybe a lunch. I said that sounded lovely. He asked if I'd be willing to sign a standard separation agreement with the usual mutual releases, which was, of course, the actual reason he was so accommodating. I said I'd be happy to have my attorney review anything they wanted to send over. His smile got a little tighter at the word attorney, but he recovered fast, said of course. Said HR would be in touch. I stood up, shook his hand, told him it had been a real experience working with him, which was, in its own way, the truest sentence I'd spoken to him in 6 months. Then I walked out of his office and back to my own, and I began the most boring, professional, thorough 2-week transition anyone at Halbrook Industrial had ever executed. I documented processes. I wrote handoff memos. I met with my direct reports. I took Cheryl to a farewell lunch. I did not at any point mention the Delaware Shell entity, the contractor, the reclassifications, or any of the 11 transactions. I did not access the paper archive room. I did not run a single additional query. I behaved from Monday morning until my last day, exactly like a 61-year-old accountant riding gracefully into retirement. On my last day, they did the sheet cake in the break room. Someone had ordered a card that said "Congratulations on your next chapter" in gold lettering. Bradley gave a short speech about my dedication and my legacy. He used the word legacy 3 times. I smiled and thanked everyone. Mina came to pick me up at 4. I carried out one small cardboard box containing a framed photo of my kids, a mug Priya had given me for Father's Day in 2011, and the fountain pen old Mr. Halbrook had gifted me on my 10th anniversary at the company. Nothing else. No files, no notes, no thumb drives, nothing that could ever be used against me in a courtroom. I drove home, I hugged my wife, I sat down on the couch, and I stayed there doing absolutely nothing for exactly 72 hours. Because Vikram had told me to let the dust settle before I made the call, Bradley needed to believe I was gone. Well and truly gone. On the morning of the 4th day, I picked up the phone. Special Agent Rebecca Ostrowski answered on the 3rd ring. Her voice was flat, professional, the kind of voice that has heard every variation of every story and is not interested in yours until you prove it's worth her time. I introduced myself, told her Vikram had given me her number. There was a small pause on the other end, then her tone shifted just slightly. "Vikram Rao told you to call me?" "Yes," I said. "He did." Another pause. "Then, Mr. Menon, I have about 90 minutes before my next meeting. Would you like to tell me why you're calling?" I told her, the same way I told Vikram, slowly, methodically, in the order the facts had come to me. The Shell entity, the signature card, the 11 transactions, the reclassifications, the contractor, the UPS store address in Wilmington, the ERP migration timeline, the retraining ultimatum. I gave her dollar amounts. I gave her dates. I gave her vendor names. I did not editorialize. I did not accuse Bradley of anything. I described what I had seen and let her draw her own conclusions. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Agent Ostrowski said, "Mr. Menon, I'd like to send 2 agents to your home this afternoon. Would that be acceptable?" I said it would. She asked if I still had access to anything from the company. I said I did not. She asked if I'd removed any documents. I said I had not. She asked if I'd discussed this with anyone besides my brother-in-law. I said I had not. There was another small pause. Then she said, "Mr. Menon, thank you. I want you to know that the way you've handled this is exactly what we hope for and almost never get. Please stay near your phone." 2 agents arrived at 3:15 that afternoon. A woman named Delgado and a man named Whitaker. They sat at my kitchen table for 4 hours. Mina made them coffee. They took a formal statement. They asked me to walk through everything again, this time with them recording. They asked follow-up questions I hadn't anticipated about the paper archive room, about who else at the company had approval authority in the ERP workflow, about which board members might have visibility into the Shell entity's dormant status. I answered everything I could and told them honestly when I didn't know something. At the end of it, Whitaker looked at me and said, "Mr. Menon, we're going to need you to be available for further interviews. This is going to move slowly. Federal white-collar cases usually take 12 to 24 months from initial complaint to indictment. We may need you to testify eventually. Are you prepared for that?" I said I was. Delgado added, "And Mr. Menon, do not discuss this case with anyone, not friends, not former colleagues, not the press. If anyone from Halbrook reaches out to you for any reason, decline politely and call us immediately." I said I understood. They left. Mina came and sat next to me on the couch. She put her hand on top of mine and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You did the right thing, Anil." I said, "I know, but I'm not sure if I'm relieved or terrified." She said, "Both. Both is normal." For the next 11 months, I heard almost nothing. I got 2 follow-up calls from Delgado asking narrow technical questions. I got one request for a written clarification about a specific journal entry structure. Otherwise, silence. I gardened. I finished a book I'd been meaning to read for 3 years. I taught my youngest granddaughter how to play chess. I flew to Boston twice to visit Priya and her family. I began to wonder, occasionally, if anything was actually going to come of it. Or if I'd done my part and the wheels of justice had simply chosen to grind elsewhere. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, my phone rang. It was Agent Ostrowski herself. Her voice had that same flat professionalism, but there was something underneath it this time. Something almost warm. She said, "Mr. Menon, I wanted you to hear this from me before you saw it in the news." This morning, a federal grand jury returned a 16-count indictment against Bradley Coleman and 3 other individuals, including the contractor you identified. The charges include wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud a corporate entity. The total amount at issue has grown considerably since your initial complaint. We're now looking at roughly $11.6 million over an 18-month period. I sat down at my kitchen table, very slowly. Mina was across the room, watching me, and I gave her a small nod and she understood, and she came over and put her hand on my shoulder. Agent Ostrowski continued. She said the private equity firm had not been involved, as far as they could determine. Bradley had been running the scheme with the outside contractor and 2 mid-level employees at the Ohio plant who had been coached into approving certain workflow steps without understanding what they were approving. The PE firm was, in fact, one of the parties that had suffered the losses. They had already publicly announced they were cooperating fully with the investigation and had installed an interim CFO to lead the internal remediation. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "Mr. Menon, the company has asked us to pass along a message. They would like to speak with you about a consulting arrangement to help unwind the fraudulent transactions and reconstruct the affected sections of the ledger. They understand you're retired and they respect any answer you give, but they wanted you to know the door is open." I thanked her, told her I'd think about it, hung up, sat there for a while. I did take the consulting engagement, eventually. 6 months, part-time, entirely remote, at a rate that would have made Bradley Coleman choke on his quarter-zip pullover. I worked with the interim CFO, a very sharp woman named Patricia N. Namdi, who had been brought in from a Big Four firm and who, on our very first video call, said to me, "Mr. Menon, I've been reading your old memos from 2003 through 2015 for 2 weeks straight. You built this company's financial architecture. It's an honor to meet you." I nearly cried. I did not, because I'm 62 years old and men my age do not cry on video calls with new colleagues. But I nearly did. Bradley took a plea deal about a year later. 14 months in federal prison plus restitution he will spend the rest of his life failing to pay. The contractor got longer. The 2 mid-level employees got probation and cooperation deals. The Ohio plant kept its 92 jobs. Halbrook Industrial is still operating today. I'm 63 now. I do the consulting work maybe 8 hours a week. I take my granddaughter to chess club on Thursdays. Mina and I are planning a trip to Kerala next spring, the first time we'll have gone back together in over a decade. I sleep well. I eat dinner at the table. I read actual books, not just quarterly reports. Here is what I want to leave you with, because I know a lot of you watching this are sitting in cubicles right now, or in break rooms, or in your cars in some parking lot, and someone at your job has recently made you feel small, made you feel replaceable. Made you feel like the decades you've given don't count for anything against a slide deck and an MBA. They are wrong. What you know matters. What you built matters. And when they underestimate you, that is not the end of your story. That is very often the beginning of the part where they finally learn who they were dealing with. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more.